this episode, we're journeying to Scotland where the killer was born and then to London, where the horrendous crime shattered the tranquility of a once peaceful community. A gruesome tale of murder of 15 people which took place in Muswell Hill in North London. Nilsen's father, Olav Magnus Nilsen, was a Norwegian soldier evacuated to Scotland after the Nazis conquered his home country in World War II. His mother, a local fisherman's daughter named Elizabeth Duffy White, married Olav in May 1942 against the opinion of her parents. Together, they had 3 children, 2 sons, Olav Jr. and Dennis, and a daughter named Sylvia. Olav was never interested in starting a family, however, and the couple divorced in 1948. As a result, the paternal role of their children was fulfilled by their maternal grandfather Andrew. Nilsen's favorite activity was to travel to the harbor alone and watch the fishing boats as they arrived and departed. Nilsen's mother remarried to another man, and the family subsequently moved to the inland village of Stricken. Nilsen during his time in the army. With the onset of puberty, Nilsen realized that he wasn't heterosexual, but he was unsure if he was gay or bisexual, because the boys he was attracted to looked suspiciously like his sister. To test his attractions, Nilsen once fondled both his sister and brother as they slept, but his brother woke up in the middle of the act. Since then, Nilsen was bullied and called a hen, Scottish slang for a girl, by his brother. Nilsen decided that he would leave Stricken and join the Army Cadet Force at age 14, as a previous step to sign for the British Army after finishing high school. His first destination was Osnabrück, a city in West Germany. There, Nilsen drank high quantities of alcohol to reduce his shyness and help himself socialize. One time, he passed out and woke up on the floor of an apartment owned by a German friend. Though no physical activity took place, this incident became a source for Nilsen's fantasy about having sex while one of the parties was mostly immobile, and he would pretend to be passed out during later drinking sessions in hopes that one of his partners made inappropriate advances on him. In 1967, Nilsen was redeployed to Aden, South Yemen, and assigned to Al-Mansoura prison. The violence from pro-independence groups led to the abductions or ambush murders of several of Nilsen's companions. Nilsen himself was nearly abducted by a local taxi driver once. The man had knocked him unconscious and placed him in the trunk of his car. However, Nilsen regained consciousness before reaching their destination. When the abductor opened the trunk with the intention of dragging him out, Nilsen knocked him to the floor with a jack handle, beat him until he was unconscious, and left him locked in his own trunk. Now granted his own room, his fantasies became unambiguously necrophilic after he discovered the painting The Raft of the Medusa. Following brief stays in Britain and Cyprus, he was destined again to Germany, where he hired a prostitute so he could have intimate relation with a woman for the first time. Nilsen found the experience overrated and depressing. Nilsen at his graduation from the police academy. Nilsen retired from the army in 1972 and returned to Stricken, where his mother repeatedly voiced her concern for Nilsen's lack of interest in female companionship. A fight between Nilsen and his brother ensued, and after its conclusion, Nilsen's brother told their mother that Nilsen was homosexual. This led to an estrangement between Nilsen and his brother, and in December, he left Stricken for London to join the Metropolitan Police. After graduating from the academy, Nilsen began to visit gay pubs, and he resigned from the force after about a year of service. The murders. Nilsen's first fatal victim was 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, whom he encountered at the Cricklewood Arms pub on December 30, 1978, after Holmes attempted unsuccessfully to buy alcohol there. Nilsen had been drinking heavily and believed that Holmes was around 17. He invited Holmes to his home, and they drank together until they fell asleep. The following morning, Nilsen awoke and found Holmes still asleep on his bed. Fearing that Holmes would leave him to spend New Year's Eve alone, Nilsen strangled Holmes with a necktie until he was unconscious, then drowned the boy in a bucket of water at the kitchen. Nilsen masturbated twice over Holmes' body and then hid it under the floorboards. 8 months later, he built a pyre behind his home and burned the body. In October, he met a student from Hong Kong, Andrew Ho, in another pub and lured him to his apartment with the promise of sex, but Ho escaped when Nilsen tried to strangle him. Nilsen was questioned about this incident by police, but Ho declined to press charges. 2 months later, Nilsen met a Canadian student, Kenneth Ockenden, in a pub, and offered to show him several London landmarks. After giving him the tour, Nilsen invited Ockenden over to his apartment. Then, he strangled Ockenden to death while he was listening to music. The following morning, Nilsen staged Ockenden's body in a number of suggestive positions, photographed it each time, and watched television with the corpse by his side. Afterward, he wrapped it in plastic bags and hid it under the floorboards. During the next 2 weeks, Nilsen dug up and reburied Ockenden's body 4 separate times. Every time, after he dug up the body and before he reburied it, he would place the body on an armchair, where it remained while
In
Nilsen
February
drank and watched
1983,
television.
an engineer from Dynarod,
The next
the
victim
drain
was
cleaning company,
16-year-old
come
hitchhiker
along
Martin
to clear
Duffy,
out some
who was
drains
first strangled in his
in
sleep
Cranley
and then
Gardens.
drowned in the kitchen sink.
And when he arrived,
Afterward, Nilsen took
found
Duffy's body to the bathroom
what he
and
thought
bathed with him.
were body parts.
He kissed, complimented, and masturbated over Duffy's body repeatedly over the 2 following days. When the body became bloated, Nilsen hid it under the floorboards. Nilsen's criminal activity increased.
They opened the
starting in
door,
August
there was this
1980.
awful smell.
After trying to spray
We
the
were quite
bodies
aware
with
of what it
deodorant and
was.
insecticide to
The
eliminate
smell of
maggots
rotting
and odors,
flesh.
he dismembered the
Human
bodies
flesh.
and burned them in a waste ground behind
Peter
his
said
home.
immediately, "Stop messing
In
us
October,
about,
when
where's the rest
Nilsen's
of the body?"
landlord decided to renovate the
And he
property,
just said,
Nilsen
over here,
disposed of his
in a
latest
wardrobe,
victim earlier
in that
and
room.
moved to an
Nilsen was
attic
then
flat in
told he was being
23
arrested
Cranley
on
Gardens
suspicion
in
of
the
causing the
suburb
death of
Muswell
someone.
Hill.
And then he was taken
Though
to our
Nilsen
police car
continued to
that we had
invite men,
outside.
he refrained from committing murders
And we
for a
drove
while
off.
because he did not have access
And I
to
sat
the garden,
in the back
nor
with
did he
Nilsen.
have enough space under the floorboards.
I
The
said,
only incidents in
"Are we
6
talking
months
about
involved
one body or
Toshimitsu
2?
Ozawa, a Japanese
And he
chef
just
who
turned
fled
round
when
and
he
looked
saw
at me
Nilsen
and he
coming
said,
in with a tie
15
and
or
ball
16.
knobs, who woke up in the morning feeling dizzy and with red eye. He went to a hospital at Nilsen's suggestion. He was later informed that someone had tried to strangle him. However, neither man reported Nilsen to the police.
The victims probably were the kind of...
Nilsen invited John Howlett for a drink. After Howlett fell asleep in his bed, Nilsen sat by his side and continued drinking before he tried to strangle him. However, Howlett awoke and struggled with Nilsen, almost overpowering him. He was eventually strangled to unconsciousness 3 times. After Nilsen realized that he was still breathing, he filled the bathtub with water and drowned Howlett for 5 minutes. Nilsen subsequently dismembered the body, flushed the flesh and organs down the toilet, and threw the bones in the trash. 2 months later, the scenario was repeated with Carl Stoddard, who slept in a sleeping bag. Stoddard awoke to Nilsen strangling him and was then taken to the bathtub and forcefully immersed. Believing that he had killed Stoddard, Nilsen placed Stoddard on an armchair. However, he realized that Stoddard was still alive when his dog, Bleep, jumped over and began to lick Stoddard's face, because Bleep never interacted with the corpses. Nilsen decided to resuscitate Stoddard, and later told him that he had accidentally strangled himself after being stuck in the sleeping bag's zip. Over the next 2 days, Stoddard fell unconscious several times and had flashes of Nilsen strangling and drowning him. Stoddard asked Nilsen about the memories, but Nilsen explained that Stoddard would have nightmares whenever he was stuck in the zip, and that he would place Stoddard in cold water to help him recover from shock. Nilsen invited Stoddard to stay over again, but he declined. Nilsen's next victim was Graham Allen, who was offered a meal and subsequently strangled while he was eating an omelette. Nilsen would later claim that Allen had accidentally choked on it. Allen's body was left in the bathtub for 3 days, and Nilsen had to ask for a day off from work so he could dismember it. On January 26, 1983, Nilsen killed his final victim, Stephen Sinclair, who was strangled while in an alcohol and drug-induced stupor on Nilsen's armchair. After killing him, Nilsen noticed that Sinclair's wrists were bandaged, removed them, and discovered that Sinclair had tried to kill himself only a few days prior. Nilsen then bathed the corpse, applied talcum powder to it, and arranged mirrors around the bed before undressing himself and lying naked next to the dead youth. After several hours, Nilsen kissed the body, wished it good night, and fell asleep alongside it. The body was subsequently dismembered and the parts placed in different bags, with Sinclair's own bandages being used to seal them. On February 4th, Nilsen complained to estate agents about the drains being clogged, seemingly unaware that it was the body parts of his own victims clogging them. When plumber Michael Catran informed Nilsen that he had found the drain packed with a fleshy substance and small bones, Nilsen joked that someone was flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken. Catran and his supervisor returned the next morning to clear the drain but found that someone else had done it. Suspicious, they examined the pipes leading to the drain and found more bones and scraps of flesh in a pipe coming from the top floor of the house, where Nilsen resided. After informing police, a pathologist confirmed that the bones were human, and that one of the flesh scraps was part of a net bearing marks typical of ligature strangulation. As 3 officers waited for Nilsen to come home, they noticed the smell of decomposition at his front door. Nilsen first feigned shock when the officers told him that the blockage was caused by human remains, but when they told him to tell them the location of the rest of the body, he led them to one of the closets containing remains. Nilsen, after being injured in prison, sometime after 1983. When asked if there were more, Nilsen said that it was a long story and that he would tell it all at the police station. While being driven there, an officer asked Nilsen if the remains belonged to one person or 2. Nilsen looked out of the window and replied, 15 or 16, since 1978. Nilsen soon made a full confession and led officers to the lot where he had destroyed the remains in Melrose Avenue. However, he claimed that he had no intention to kill until the moment right before murder. He also claimed that he ignored the reason for the murders, adding that he hoped the police would tell him. On November 4, 1983, Nilsen was found guilty of 6 murders and 1 attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison without parole for 25 years. The possibility of parole was eliminated in 1994 by Home Secretary Michael Howard, who replaced Nilsen's sentence with one of whole life order. Nilsen reacted to the news by saying that he accepted his life sentence and had no desire to be free again. On May 12, 2018, Nilsen died as a result of complications following a stomach surgery at the age of 72. While incarcerated at the Full Sutton Prison in East Yorkshire, England, Nilsen was transferred to a hospital in York on May 10, suffering from abdominal pains. During the procedure, Nilsen suffered a blood clot and later died. An autopsy ruled his cause of death was pulmonary embolism and retroperitoneal hemorrhage. Modus operandi. Nilsen's victims were young homosexual men, all of whom he met in bars or transients, and all of whom he encountered randomly. He would lure them to his home by offering them food, alcohol, or shelter, and strangled them with a ligature after they passed out or fell asleep. If the victim was unconscious but not dead yet, he would drown them in the sink, bathtub, or a bucket of water. Afterward, he would bathe the corpses, shave them, apply makeup, clothe them, prop them on the bed or armchair, and destroy all of their personal belongings. During the subsequent period of cohabitation, he would embrace and talk to them, also masturbating and performing non-penetrative sexual acts on the bodies. While living in Melrose Avenue, Nilsen eviscerated the bodies and abandoned the organs in a fence behind his property or near Gladstone Park. He later dismembered the bodies and burned them in pyres, adding car tires to the blazes in order to mask the smell of burning flesh. After the flames died down, he searched the ashes for recognizable remains with a rake and smashed any he could find. When he was in Muswell Hill, he dismembered the still fresh bodies in the bathtub or the kitchen, boiled the heads, hands, and feet, flushed the flesh, internal organs, and smaller bones down the toilet, and kept the rest of the bones in bags until he took them out with the trash. He was Britain's worst serial killers, so what do you think? Did he get a befitting end to his life causing so much pain? What was going in his mind when he was committing these heinous crimes of unspeakable nature? If you like my videos, please subscribe to my channel.